Hi, everyone. On today's podcast, we're going to talk with journalist Sarah Kliff about her investigative reporting on cord blood banking. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Evidence-Based Birth Podcast. I am so excited to introduce our honored guest. Sarah Kliff is an investigative reporter with the New York Times, where she covers the American healthcare system. Many of her stories have explored topics related to childbirth, including cord blood banking, the maternal mortality crisis, and prenatal genetic testing. Sarah lives in Washington, D.C. with her family. And in 2024, Sarah and her colleague Azine Goriashi published an article called Promised Cures, Tainted Cells, How Cord Blood Banks Mislead Parents, which we're going to be talking about on the podcast today. Sarah, welcome to the Evidence-Based Birth Podcast.
Yep, thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to talk with you. I told our podcast team the day I read your article is like, we have to interview her if she'll come on the podcast, because I was actually working on a project, a new pocket guide we're publishing called the Evidence to Newborn Procedures. And I was researching cord blood banking on the day your article came out. So it was a really interesting coincidence. And I just loved reading your investigative report with you and that you and your colleague printed. And you also had like a shorter article kind of explaining the basics. So can you start off by just sort of introducing yourself and then telling us a little bit about what is cord blood banking and what got you interested in this subject?
Sure. Yeah. So like you said, I'm an investigative reporter at the New York Times. I write about healthcare and I'm particularly interested in childbirth. As you know, as I'm sure your listeners know, there's just it's a lot of people's first introduction to like a major medical event. And there's just so many things that are not evidence-based and really I find worth looking into. Cord blood banking is when you have a baby, often your OBGYN or somewhere in the process, you'll get a little pamphlet about saving a little bit of your baby's cord blood. It's a really simple procedure. The OBGYN who's delivering puts a needle into the umbilical cord. They draw out some of the stem cells. It's frozen and shipped off to be stored for the one day you might need it, which is essentially kind of the pitch the companies doing this cord blood banking make. I vaguely remember hearing it. I have two kids who are 2 and 6. I kind of remember getting that pamphlet at some point. I didn't think that much about it until I was actually doing some reporting on some other topics in reproductive health related to fertility clinics. And while I was doing that research, I'd written a short story about a company that makes some IVF-related products. And someone I reached out to said, hey, we actually also own a really big cord blood bank. Have you thought about looking into cord blood banking? Because I think there's a lot of problems there. And they pointed me to a recent FDA inspection of that facility. And that is basically what led me to writing this story.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I had a similar introduction, got the pamphlets at my prenatal appointments, probably my very first prenatal appointment with my first child. And this was like 17 years ago. And I remember thinking, well, there's no way I could afford that. So I didn't even consider it. But I also kind of, being a nurse and a medical professional, I knew that the situations where that would be necessary were incredibly rare. So I was like, not going to spend, like from my perspective, I'm not going to spend the money for something that I almost would never, ever need. So how many parents use cord blood banking? Like, is it really common or is it just a very small minority?
It's a small minority, but a decent number of people when you add up over the years who have done it. So we estimated about 2 million people are paying to store their cord blood somewhere in the United States. Currently. So that's a lot of accumulated cord blood. But it seems to be growing a little bit. One thing we found is that the biggest cord blood registry, their inventory has doubled over the past decade from about 500,000 samples stored in 2014 to over 1 million today. So it's certainly not most parents, but it's also a decent number of people who, are paying both to collect it and then year after year you pay a storage fee to hang on to it.
Okay, and so that's private cord blood banking we're talking about, I'm assuming.
Yes.
What's the difference between a private cord blood bank and a public cord blood bank?
Yes, that's a great question. So private cord blood banks are where you pay to store your cord blood, the stem cells in your cord blood, for your own potential personal use in the future. Public cord blood banking is donating your cord blood to this network. You could think of them like blood banks, essentially, for stem cells. They're public. They hang on to stem cells. If someone might need a transplant one day, their oncologist can go into the network and see if there's a good match out there. So in that case, you don't pay any money, but you also don't have a guarantee of being able to use those cells. Those cells are essentially donated for the public good.
Okay, so it's similar to blood donation or
Yeah.
plasma donation. It goes into a bank. And then it's my understanding too that can be really helpful for people who are from like minority populations who maybe have trouble finding a stem cell match. There might be benefits for being able to access that.
Yeah, there might be. Although one of the things that surprised me in this reporting is that just overall, doctors are using cord blood a lot less than they used to a decade ago. That there are some new technologies that were developed around 2008 or so that make it easier for the patient, like the one you're talking about, to get a transplant from someone who's not quite as closely matched. Basically, the big medical breakthrough was figuring out this cocktail of drugs that could help them not reject that match, even though it wasn't exactly perfect. So one thing you see both with the privately banked cord blood, the publicly banked cord blood, it's just being used a lot less than it was a decade ago. The medical utility has just kind of plummeted for a good reason, for essentially being able to figure out how to use stem cells that are found in blood rather than the stem cells found in cord blood to get equally good medical outcomes for people who need them.
That strikes me as like a really big, important point.
Yeah.
That the entire medical treatments for things like, say you have leukemia, you need a stem cell transplant. So you're saying instead of going to a cord blood bank to get stem cells, they can harvest those stem cells from someone's blood, and that's a match for you?
Yeah, exactly. And that's so there's basically, I didn't fully understand this when I went into this reporting. There are basically 3 places you can get stem cells. You can get them from peripheral blood that just circulates in your body. You can get them from an umbilical cord, which is the cord blood. You can also get them from bone marrow. For the past decade or so, the vastly preferred source of stem cells is from just the blood that circulates in your body. It's pretty expensive to store cord blood. You kind of have to pay for it to sit in liquid nitrogen for years and years and years. Whereas with peripheral blood, you can, it's definitely more of a process than just making a blood donation, but you can get it from a relative. It doesn't have to be stored.
It doesn't have to be a perfect match anymore.
It does not have to be a perfect match. This was a big breakthrough from researchers at Johns Hopkins University around 2008. They figured out a way to use the right anti-rejection drug. So it does not have to be a perfect match. And that really opens up the possibility of using the stem cells you can just get from somebody else's blood.
Okay, so this really strikes me as like a huge point. In the last 10 years, we've seen all these advances where cord blood isn't needed. But at the same time, these cord blood companies are ramping up their marketing. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the promises or the marketing like slogans or things like that they're using to kind of attract people to paying for it?
Yeah, some of the things you see really repeated is the idea this is an investment in your child's future. They talk about a healthier tomorrow as a phrase we saw show up in a lot of the marketing. The idea that there's an unknown future and one day you might want to have these cells at the ready if your child got seriously ill. One thing we saw repeated again and again is this claim that cord blood could treat 80 different conditions. And that's a reason there's so many of these conditions.
80 conditions sounds like a lot of potential uses for cord blood.
Yes.
Is that really true?
It took us a while to actually find the list of 80 conditions. One thing we saw again and again was the cord blood banks would say 80 conditions, and then we would ask them for a list and not get an answer. We finally did from Cord Blood Registry, the largest cord blood bank in the US. They sent it us to a study as a source, which cited another study, which cited a list that had been put together by the Parents Guide to Cord Blood Foundation, which is a nonprofit that does work in the cord blood space. I reached out to the woman who made the list, and she basically said this is hype. She thought it was misleading the way the cord blood companies were using this list for 2 reasons. One is that a lot of these conditions, while they have this long list, they're exceedingly rare, maybe a handful of cases each year, a long list of things your child is very, very unlikely to develop. The other thing, she felt was misleading about it, kind of goes back to what we were just talking about, is that these aren't diseases that can only be treated by cord blood. These are diseases where stem cells are used in treatment. And again, you can get those stem cells from other places. You can get them from blood, from a living relative, from a donor. the marketing, it made it seem like you have this one opportunity when your baby's born. This is your only moment to collect the umbilical cord blood. And while that technically is true, I think it's misleading because there are other opportunities to get stem cells. If you needed your child's stem cells at any point, you could collect them from the child themselves, while they are living.
I've run into that in research before too, where one person cites another person cites another person, and you're like tracing back to find.
Yes.
But I'm like, it was something. I had really good professors. It sounds like you had amazing teachers. You always find the primary, the original source.
Yes.
Who originally said this, because they should have evidence to back it up. And
and
like
on the
they don't.
websites, they're all like linking towards each other, and it's kind of this like web where, and that always I feel like is a bit of a red flag to me. Like something might be up here if nobody actually has the original source.
I pulled up a large private cord blood bank website right now called cryo-cell.com, and it explains what stem cells are. It says cord blood stem cells are currently used to treat nearly 80 diseases. So again, they use that 80 number. Over 50,000 transplants worldwide have been performed using stem cells from umbilical cord blood. More opportunities are increasing. It can cross the blood-brain barrier and reduce inflammation, which could treat conditions that have been untreatable. And that it can not only safeguard your specific child's future, but could be used to treat siblings, parents, and other close relatives.
Yeah, a few things jump out at me in that. One, that 50,000 figure, I think it's important to note the vast majority of those are using publicly banked cord blood, not privately banked cord blood. The number of cord blood transplants done with privately banked cord blood are exceedingly rare. I think we're down to, I'd have to look back at my story for the exact numbers, but about a dozen or so a year. That mention of crossing the blood-brain barrier, that sounds like one of the claims that's made based on clinical trials. So these are things they're experimenting with, but things, that it's not necessarily
it's not currently being used for any medical treatment.
Yeah. So that's like another thing that kind of jumps out at me in that little piece of marketing.
I noticed that as well. A lot of the things they talked about, they might be scientists studying some of these things in very specific, very small research studies, but it's not like available. Like you can't go to your doctor and be like, can you give me this to reduce inflammation?
Yeah, we've even seen that a few cord blood banks, advertise it can be used to treat diabetes or hearing loss. And then when you kind of dig into, okay, what's your evidence for that? It's sometimes mouse studies, sometimes very small studies with, 10 or so children. People are exploring a lot of things all the time, but there are very few proven, FDA-approved treatments using cord blood right now.
And then some of the other things I'm just seeing, just if you go to the website and look, it says like protecting what matters most, your baby's health safety net. This is a once-in-a-lifetime chance to safeguard your child's health affordably. What are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I mean, that once-in-a-lifetime marketing, again, I think is pretty misleading because if you did need your child's own stem cells, you have another chance to get them because you're going to have that child there. And it is a little bit invasive. They're going to have to take some medications to increase their stem cell production. They're going to have to be hooked up to, a machine that pulls the stem cells out. It is technically true. It's your only chance to get the umbilical cord cells, but it is not true. It's your only chance to get these stem cells. These stem cells are going to be with your child their entire life.
I also saw one company, you could pay extra for them to cryo-freeze your placenta. Have you heard about that?
I haven't seen placenta. I've seen cord tissue. And that's another one where there's some trials, but with the with the stem cells, there are clinical uses. The cord blood tissue, everything is currently investigational and experimental. Tissue is another one I've seen. And often you see it as like a kind of roll-up package deal where it's like if you store more things, you get a bit of a discount. So the idea, like, why not add it on? Placenta is a bit new to me, but it kind of reminds me of the cord tissue, like another item they can hang on to from your birth and charge you for storage.
So is it possible a parent, like if their child was enrolled in a clinical trial, say for autism or cerebral palsy or something like that, where they have a condition and there's this experimental treatment, are you seeing parents be able to use their cord blood in those clinical trials?
Sometimes, but not always. So we talked to the researchers who run those trials. Most of them are based at Duke in the two areas you mentioned, autism and cerebral palsy. And what they told us is about half the time, the cord blood that parents have paid to bank is unusable. So, and there's usually two main reasons why it's unusable. Either there weren't enough stem cells, the count was just too low for it to be clinically useful, or it's contaminated, that there's some kind of bacteria that's been growing in it. And those are the two reasons why, about half the cord blood that these researchers at Duke review ends up being unusable. One other thing I think is interesting about those studies, the cerebral palsy study in particular is about to move into phase 3, and that will only be using publicly banked cord blood. The basically government bodies that oversee clinical trials, they wanted more standardization in the storage process for this larger phase 3 trial. So parents will not be able to use privately banked cord blood in kind of the largest of the cord blood studies that are coming up.
Which makes sense if like half of the privately banked blood that people were requesting was contaminated. That also seems like a huge thing that parents need to know.
Yeah. So not half contaminated, half low volume or half, but in any half low volume or
half were
contaminated. Unusable for some sort of reason.
Okay.
I mean, remember, it's very, very few people who try and even withdraw their cord blood. The vast majority of people pay for storage with never using it. And the cord blood companies kind of discuss it as an insurance policy. You just want it to sit there in case you need it.
Oh, they call it like this is an insurance policy for your child.
Yeah, we've seen some people. Yeah, sometimes we've seen like language kind of comparing it to insurance. So it's already a very small pool of people who ever even find out what is in their stored sample, because most people just never
it gets sent away and you don't know.
It just sits in a tank of liquid nitrogen for a very, very long time.
And then when do they eventually dispose of it?
It's actually something families wrestle with, especially the ones who have paid to store it. Some, when their kid turns 18, but there's some people keep paying for it afterwards. One of the things that this didn't make it into our story, but one of the challenges that parents are wrestling with is some of the companies keep increasing their storage fees. So, you've been storing for a decade and then they say, okay, now it's $50 more this year. And then it's $25 more the next year. And parents kind of wrestle with like, well, I've stored it so long, maybe I should keep storing it. It's getting more unaffordable. There's really no cutoff, we know, of like how long it can be stored for, which kind of lets the cord blood companies make the pitch that, why not keep storing it if you've paid for it this long?
Why not?
Yeah.
Did you talk with any families that this happened to, where they had paid to store their cord blood and it was unusable?
Yeah, I talked to a lot of them, and a lot of them are in Facebook groups together, kind of focused on stem cell treatment for either autism or cerebral palsy. And, there's one family that kind of sticks out, this family, the Edwards in Florida, who they had banked I believe it was they banked one of their son's cord blood and then had another son develop cerebral palsy. And they were like, oh, great. Like, this is the use case. We saved it for the what if, and we have the what if. They spent about $3,000 banking that cord blood. But when they went to pull the sample, they found out it was contaminated with E. coli and was unusable. And one of the things that, that family was pretty upset about was that that the testing for contamination had happened right when the sample had been stored. The company knew from the get-go that it was contaminated. They kept paying for multiple years of storage and only found out it was contaminated when they requested the sample. But even after that experience, they kind of figured, okay, this was bad luck. They had another baby on the way. So they decided to bank that baby's cord blood. They paid $650 to collect the next baby's cord blood. That sample was also unusable because it didn't have enough cells. And I think their experience just really showed some of the limitations. And a lot of these families, they just felt crushed by the development. They felt like they were kind of holding on to this hope. They felt like they'd done the right thing. Some of them, had an older child with cerebral palsy or autism. And when they're having their new baby, thought, oh, great, I'm going to save this cord blood and use it to treat my older child. And we're just really upset to find out that, it was unusable.
Mm. Did you talk with anyone who was able to successfully do a treatment with their banked cord blood?
Yeah, I talked to some families who were able to do treatment with cord blood. Some of them felt like their children had gains. Other ones didn't. If you look at the phase 2 research, the cerebral palsy trial, did meet some of its endpoints. It showed some improvements in the condition. The autism trials have had a little bit less success in showing kind of clinically significant change. But there are certainly some parents who feel like they've had some very good outcomes using the cord blood that they stored. And, the cord blood companies obviously will point to that and discuss that on a lot of their marketing materials and websites.
Like they like to share the success stories.
Yeah.
Mhm. We haven't really dug into the cost. You've thrown a few
Mhm.
numbers out there. Like,
Yeah.
what is the range in terms of how much does it cost for the initial collection and then the storage?
Yeah, so the initial collection, it varies from company to company. It varies if you get, like, a lot of them have coupons floating around there, or it also varies if you're, willing to store multiple things. It's usually around like $500 or so for the initial storage of cord blood, and then a few $100s for paying fees each year to keep storing your cord blood. So I'd say most families who do this end up, in total spending a few $1,000s on cord blood storage.
And I've seen some startups, though, charging more,
Yeah.
which I thought was interesting. Like I said, adding in more add-ons, like you mentioned, the cord tissue.
Yeah, the
the
cord
placenta.
tissue. Some
Mhm.
of them like offer certain. I didn't look super deeply into this, but they offered like genetic testing of your cord blood that might tell you something about your child's future health. You certainly see a lot of add-ons. Cord blood banking is the core product, and then these other things that get tacked onto it.
Yeah, and I saw, like, for example, one startup called Anya Health.
Yeah.
Their
Mhm.
their prices were really high. I was kinda shocked. It was like $49 a month
Yeah.
if you commit to 20 years.
Yeah, and I think their idea is the $49 looks small when you think of it on a month, but then if you multiply that by the 20 years of 12 months, it starts getting quite large.
Yeah, and they'll store it for your child's life for
Yeah.
$5,999.
Yeah, so it's like, it's not nothing. And, one thing that kind of, surprised me when I would ask cord blood companies about these fees, for some reason, this kept multiple people would respond, well, people spend that much on a luxury handbag, so why not spend it on your child's health? And it just felt like
Yeah.
you might get more use out of a luxury handbag than you would out of, that felt like an odd comparison and kind of,
It is, and it's also people who are having their first baby, who I
yeah.
imagine are often the one they don't
Mhm.
typically have a lot of money. Like, that is not usually it's you're at an age and a time when you're
Mhm.
still trying to make ends meet, and there's all these expenses with having a child that can be very
Yeah.
stressful.
But
So,
you're also like I remember having my first kid and you're so vulnerable and you're a great marketing target because you really want to do what's best, right? Like you're trying to get the right stroller and you're reading all the sleep safety and you're trying to set your kid up for a wonderful future. And, I think the pitch that they make really tries to, I talked to some of the former sales representatives and some of them they felt a little queasy pitching this product that they didn't feel had much evidence and felt like they were like preying on first time parents' fears, in order to close their sales.
yeah, the fears and anxieties, and then also kind
Hmm.
of the lack of knowledge. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, I felt like I had a little bit of an advantage being a nurse and being like, I never
Hmm.
see this used. So, like,
Yeah.
why would I do this? But a lot of
Hmm.
people think, oh, this is like a thing I'm supposed to do.
Yeah. I mean, I remember feeling like a teeny tiny bit guilty not buying it, thinking like,
Really?
yeah, because like I looked at the brochures. This was, 6 years ago before, I ever looked into it seriously. But I kind of looked at the brochures and I said, I don't think we'll use that. But there was like a little twinge of guilt there for, not investing in something, for this baby that I cared so much about.
Yeah, that's true. And one thing that I learned in reading more about cord blood banking is that many states have laws that require parents to be given information about it.
Yeah, yeah, which is kind of interesting. There was this movement in like the early 2000s when, before all these developments with anti-rejection drugs, to really build up the network of public cord blood banking and
So
like make
they were trying to get the info out about the public cord, the donations. Okay.
yeah. And I think all of it just ends up kind of getting talked about in one fell swoop. Some of the state laws also require, educating on both public and private cord blood banking. So I think there was this well-intentioned effort to kind of let people know about donating their cord blood, but it also might have unintentionally kind of fueled the rise of private cord blood banking as well.
Another thing that I learned from, your readings and some of the other research is the whole fact that this private cord blood banking is kind of like an unregulated area. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's in a few ways. One of the things that makes it different from most things that happen in an OBGYN's office is it's not covered by insurance. There's all these rules about kickbacks and payments that cover any sort of product, like a pharmaceutical company, a medical device company, they cannot pay your doctor money to use a certain product. There's strict anti-kickback laws about that cover anything that insurance, private or public, is paying for. Those don't really exist in this space. There's very little oversight of some of the kind of fees that are paid to doctors for collecting cord blood. Then there's also the storage side, which is overseen by the FDA, but a lot of the experts we talked to felt like it was pretty lax, in terms of not having many standards for how to store this to make sure it does not get contaminated and become unusable in the future.
When I went on the websites for the private cord blood banks, some of them were just saying, like, you just stick it in this like box and mail it back to us. And I'm thinking, like, is that what you're supposed to do? Like, unrefrigerated? I was a little confused by kind of the lax mailing of it back.
There was an FDA inspection of Cord Blood Registry's facility in Tucson, Arizona at the beginning of this year, which found multiple deficiencies in this space. One of the things they found was evidence of bacteria growing in the area where the cord blood is processed and kind of taken out of those boxes you're talking about. They found that a number of samples were coming in without their temperature being logged, which meant, the cord blood could have sat out in the sun or sat out in the cold at some point in the shipping process. And that could have, rendered particularly, heat could have just rendered these cells unusable. There are other problems they found with leaky bags, with record keeping. And so this stuff does often get noticed when the FDA comes to inspect, but those inspections are every few years and the problems can kind of continue for a while unnoticed.
So do doctors get paid for collecting the cord blood for private or public cord blood banks?
Yes, definitely for private cord blood banks. And we talked to a number of doctors, former sales representatives who all told us this was just kind of standard practice across the industry. The payments seem to range from about $150 to $750 for, what is essentially 1 or 2 minutes of work. What the obstetrician has to do in this situation is basically after the baby is delivered, they put a needle into the umbilical cord, they pull out some cord blood and they put it into a tube, and that is the work that they are doing. We got a range of opinions about whether these fees influence provider behavior. We talked to some doctors who said, the payments were high for the work being done, but they weren't enough to influence the work that we do. We talked to sales representatives who said, there were some doctors who were quite motivated by the fees, and it made it an easier pitch to kind of have them stock these kits in their storage room, knowing that there was kind of that fee associated with them. And we did have some doctors who say they felt uncomfortable, they were worried about violating ethical standards, and they just stopped taking these fees. So I thought that was, a bit telling that some obstetricians said, these fees just make us too uncomfortable. We're not even going to accept them. But that did surprise me. And I think it's one thing that's important for patients.
Because it's like the only example I know of right now of like some kind of outside financial incentive to perform an intervention that ends up costing the patient a lot of money.
Well, mostly for most things, it would be illegal. If your insurance is covering it, there's a contract between your doctor and your insurance that they're going to get paid X amount for doing this service. Cord blood collection exists in this kind of gray area where it's in your doctor's office. It seems pretty medical. It's not covered by insurance. So there's basically no oversight or rules about the cord blood companies compensating the doctors. So it's typical stuff you see in pharmaceutical marketing. The sales reps will drop by the obstetrician's offices. They'll bring them lunch. They'll give them a bit of a pitch. But then there's this like other thing that's happening in cord blood collecting of these fees that get paid when the doctor, does collect cord blood.
And then what role, if any, does celebrity endorsement play in this whole industry?
Yeah, it does play a role. So the most recent, I don't know how major you consider, but major endorsement of cord blood making was from Chrissy Teigen, the supermodel with many, many Instagram followers, has, I believe, 4 children at this point, and married to singer John Legend. She did a campaign with the cord blood registry a year or two ago, where she posted on her Instagram. She went on the Kelly Clarkson show. And we actually found they had submitted, the cord blood registry, which produced this campaign, had submitted this marketing effort for an award where they mentioned that Chrissy Teigen brought in 5,800 new customers and generated $6.6 million in revenue, suggesting that these celebrity endorsements do have an effect, and they do matter, and they do encourage people to look into cord blood banking.
That's really fascinating. And did she disclose, like, she was being paid to do that?
I think it was pretty clear. I mean, the cord blood registry marketing was everywhere. I think it had the little paid
She
partnership
probably
thing
had
on
like a
it.
hashtag ad or something.
Yeah. I
on
think
the-
like it was made pretty clear. And, she does say repeatedly, I'm partnering with the cord blood registry, but also talks about why she feels like this is important to her as a mom and her family. So kind of talked about her personal story of endorsing this for her family.
Yeah. And the cord blood registry is a for-profit.
Yes, it's part of a larger medical device company called Cooper Surgical, which purchased. It's gone through a few different owners, but they're the most recent purchaser of the cord blood registry.
I did want to point out another difference between private and public is that, from what I read, the doctors don't get paid for the public cord
No,
blood.
some of the public
procedures.
ones, they do provide a fee. It tends to be smaller. It's a little. The public cord blood banks have found that they've struggled a little bit to keep up their supplies. So sometimes they do pay. Sometimes they do pay fees, but they tend to be relatively modest.
Relatively smaller. I also saw something interesting where I saw a doula recommending
Mm,
cord blood, and that really kind of, made my ears pop up because usually you don't
yeah.
see doulas promoting those kind of commercial
Hmm.
enterprises. So I did a little digging, and I found that some of the cord blood companies will provide kickbacks to like non-doctors. So
Interesting.
yeah, so people who use their platform to advertise, they'll often get maybe 1 free year of storage or something
Oh,
like
yeah.
that.
That was another thing. Actually, we found that obstetricians, they would often provide free storage when they had their own baby, that the cord blood companies would let them store for free. I think one other way, there you kind of see this lack of regulation. When I'm doing my research on kickbacks and payments, usually you can see the relationships between doctors and pharmaceutical companies pretty clearly. The federal government requires whenever a pharmaceutical company makes a payment to a doctor, maybe they go to an educational event, maybe they go to a lunch, that payment is posted to a public website. And often when I'm doing my research, I go into that public website to see kind of the financial relationships between doctors and pharmaceutical or medical device companies. You can't do that with cord blood. Again, because it is not covered by
It's
insurance,
not regulated.
you
Yeah.
can't go look up your obstetrician and see how much money did they get from the various cord blood companies. That's just not public. So that's another way where, like you mentioned with this doula, that there's less transparency in this particular space than there would be if you wanted to see, how much they get from a gynecological device maker. You couldn't see that with cord blood.
What other information do you think parents might want to be aware about, when they're making this decision, if it's even something they're considering? We haven't talked about delayed cord clamping. Like what, for a lot of our listeners want to have delayed cord clamping. Is that possible with this?
Yeah, the banks advertise that it is. It's not one of the claims I looked into very deeply, although I did hear some concerns that you're going to run into the low cell count issue more often if you bank after doing delayed clamping. I don't want to speak too far on that because that's just not one of the issues that I got super deep into, but that is something that's certainly coming up more
Like
now.
the
And
longer you delay clamping the cord, the more the blood goes into your baby. And a lot of
exactly.
parents want the cord to be delayed, the clamping, until the cord is white and like not pulsating. So I would imagine there's not very much left if you wait that long.
I would guess so. Again, the cord blood
Yeah.
companies, they claim that you can do delayed cord clamping and collect.
Some of their websites, I was looking at the protocols and they said you could delay cord clamping up to 60 seconds, but that's like the bare minimum for what is considered delayed cord clamping.
Mhm.
So a lot of parents prefer
Yeah.
3 to 5 minutes. So It sounds like, I think there would be
Yeah.
a 1 minute
Yeah.
limit. Yeah.
And there's just not going to be a ton of research into this space, unfortunately, which makes it kind of a hard decision to make without much evidence to go on.
Do you feel like this industry is going to keep growing? Like, has it been growing? Are you seeing new companies jump into the space, all kind of wanting to market to new parents?
I think it's going to just keep steadily, slowly growing. I don't see a future where most of us are banking cord blood, but I think it's going to keep growing despite the fact that cord blood has become less and less clinically useful over the past decade or so. You do see new companies. There's the one you mentioned, Anja Health, which is backed by, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce his name correctly, but Serena Williams' husband, the Reddit founder, Alexis
Oh, yeah. So it was like a
Ohanian.
private equity firm.
Yeah, it has some private equity backing. And one interesting thing about that company we learned is they're actually renting space from a public cord blood bank that lately has not has as many samples coming in. So they're using the storage of kind of this, as there's been less demand for publicly banked cord blood, they're seeing some of their revenue dry up, the public banks. And we found in this situation that a public bank was renting its space to this private cord blood bank, kind of got a very millennial, almost like Warby Parker-ish design to its website. And so that was kind of an interesting interplay between the private and public banking. But you certainly see new companies coming online. You do see some going out of business.
What happened? Yeah, what happens if you're banking your cord blood and the company goes out of business?
Yeah. Often they, sell to another company. So they get absorbed by a larger cord blood bank generally. But there is the possibility of, you're just kind of out of luck. And you do wonder about like the transport of samples, if there could be challenges there. But I mean, I think one thing that made me think this area is going to keep growing is so the biggest cord blood bank in the country, cord blood registry, it was purchased by Cooper Surgical, which is a big medical device company, in 2021 for $1.6 billion.
Oh my
And they were
God.
purchasing the cord blood registry. It was part of kind of this little group of other companies, a large sperm bank. But Cooper Surgical attributed 2/3 of that company's value to umbilical storage. So a big medical device company a few years ago thought that this business was worth roughly $1 billion, which makes you think that they think it's going to keep growing.
As somebody who also is in business, they see this as recurring revenue. It's like the Netflix
Exactly.
model, except at a higher,
Except with Netflix,
point.
you have to keep making a lot of new shows. And what works so well about this business model is most people never take anything out. Most people just pay the storage fees. So you have a lot more samples.
And you never actually put your hands on the product and you're not receiving anything out of it all that time.
Exactly. And the pitch is like, that's an okay way to use this product, right? It's insurance. It's there if you need it, but hopefully you're never going to need it.
Wow. What if parents are listening right now and they're like, I feel like I got duped or, just like I think one of the reasons people might feel duped is they weren't given all of this information, right? They're given the marketing materials, but they're not given like the behind the scenes kind of facts about what's going on.
Right. And it's like unreasonable to expect, parents to try and find that information. This is my full-time job and it took me months to, dig up all of this stuff.
And your OBGYNs aren't necessarily giving you all the info either, right?
Yeah, and your incentives might actually be a little misaligned with your OBGYN because of, the collection fees.
There's a conflict of interest.
There's a bit of a conflict of interest there. One thing they can do immediately, and some readers did contact me about doing, is, reaching out to their cord blood bank and asking for, a report on, is there any contamination or how many cells are there? Some of the cord blood banks will not provide that information proactively, but you can ask for it. So I did hear from some families who were doing that after reading our reporting. So that feels like one actual concrete step that someone...
So you mean like, give me the report from when you received my sample. I want to know if it was contaminated.
Exactly. Because a lot of people only get those reports when they try and join a clinical trial. Everybody I talked to was someone who learned that their cord blood was contaminated, only learned that when they tried to withdraw it.
Did they get refunds? Or like, that seems not only unethical, but fraudulent to keep charging these storage fees when they know
Some did get refunds, some didn't. Some were really upset about that. I know one family was offered like 50% back, didn't accept it because they felt like they were owed all of it back. So it seems to just vary from company to company.
But like literally some of these companies they run the report when they receive the sample. They see it's contaminated or
Yeah.
there's not enough cells and they put it in storage anyways and start billing you every
Yeah.
year.
Yeah. And, like I've reviewed some emails that people with contaminated cord blood had with representatives of these companies. They will often, say, well, look, birth isn't a sterile process. Things can get in there, but that doesn't really explain why families were never told. And, these FDA inspection reports we reviewed suggested that it's not just birth being an unsterile experience that is leading to contamination. There might be things going on within these processing facilities that matter too.
So I guess parents, they're asked to make this decision. Are you going to
Mhm.
bank your cord blood or not, public or private? And it's my understanding the public cord blood banking is only available at like certain hospitals
Yeah.
around the United States.
It's often very difficult. I remember I actually tried, I have an almost 3-year-old, and I tried to donate her cord blood. And I live in Washington, D.C., and there was not a single hospital in Washington, D.C., a relatively major metro area, that participates in public cord blood banking. Unlike private banking, which you can bring your kit, you can sign up for, you can't really bring in a public banking kit. If your hospital doesn't participate in it, I don't think you're going to be able to donate.
And then the other decision is if
Mhm.
you've already collected your cord blood and it's in storage, and then you can request the report. But some parents may also decide to just stop paying for the storage. That would be a hard decision, though, I imagine, once you've already done all that work and paid all that.
Yeah, you kind of have the sense of like, I've already paid for it, and so why not keep paying for it? I think it's a kind of personal decision about whether you think there's potential value in the cells you're storing or not.
What do you think is the number one takeaway from this whole report that you did?
I think it's always to bring some, I mean, this is probably just from being an investigative healthcare reporter, just to always, feel okay asking questions about things doctors are recommending. And it can feel a little uncomfortable, to question someone who's providing your care. But I also think there's just reason to ask questions about things that are being recommended. If you're comfortable, asking your doctor, are you getting paid a collection fee for, when I bake my cord blood? One of the takeaways for me is when you see these big promises, a healthier future, a once in a lifetime opportunity, an insurance policy, to always look at them with a little skepticism and kind of think. But at the same time, I'm very sympathetic to the marketing. Again, I say I was someone before I did this reporting who felt a little guilty about not doing this. So it's a tricky, I think, I don't know, in the American healthcare system, we're just put in often like tricky situations where we don't have all the information.
Yeah.
And it's a lot to put on
Information is
patient.
power. And so they're asking you to make a decision with faulty information too,
Yeah,
not giving you all
exactly.
the sides. I noticed is that the American Academy of Pediatrics does not recommend
No,
private cord blood banking, but they do recommend, they do support public cord blood
public
banking,
banking.
which I thought was
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
And we interviewed a lot of, Azine and I, my co-author, a lot of oncologists, pediatric oncologists, and routinely we're told by all of them, if this gives people any way to make this decision, none of them recommended privately banking cord blood. We didn't find a single one who regularly works with stem cells who recommended banking your cord blood privately. We talked to one cancer expert at Memorial Sloan Kettering who kind of stuck with me, who he treats sickle cell anemia, which is a condition you can treat with stem cells. And he repeatedly said he's seen families who come in, one of their children has sickle cell anemia, and they want to use the cord blood that they've stored. And he said every time this happens, it's just never enough volume. They always have to get some more stem cells from somewhere else. And some of these families, he said, are a little bit crushed by this news. But I think it kind of just speaks to the often lack of value in the product that's being paid to be stored.
That's a good point. It's also interesting you mentioned the oncologist not recommending it, because I'd also read that often if a child has leukemia, they recommend against using the
You
child's own
can't
stem
actually
cell.
use, yeah, this surprised me
Yeah.
too in the reporting, that if your child has leukemia, you cannot use their own stem cells to treat them because they're predisposed to be malignant in that way, essentially. So you would always, what the cord blood companies would pitch is that well, what if there's a sibling? And if you store the sibling's cord blood, you'd have a match. And that is true. But you also have that sibling again right there. And the sibling could be a donor via blood donation if needed to treat, their sister or brother. But yeah, that surprised me. I think a lot of us think about like vaguely stem cells and treating cancer and stem cell transplants, but generally you cannot treat leukemia or any other blood cancers with that person's own stem cells.
Yeah, they have to come from a donor.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Sarah, I feel like people listening today, they're going to just be like, mind's blown, learn something new. People have been asking me about cord blood banking for ages now. And so I'm glad you came on and cleared the air. And I'm really thankful for your investigative work and the other pieces you've written as well. We'll make sure to link to those in the show notes because they're so well done. So Sarah, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Yes. Thank you for having me.
Today's podcast was brought to you by the Evidence-Based Birth Professional Membership. The free articles and podcasts we provide to the public are supported by our professional membership program at Evidence-Based Birth. Our members are professionals in the childbirth field who are committed to being change agents in their community. Professional members at EBB get access to continuing education courses with up to 23 contact hours, live monthly training sessions, an exclusive library of printer-friendly PDFs to share with your clients, and a supportive community for asking questions and sharing challenges, struggles, and success stories. We offer monthly and annual plans, as well as scholarships for students and for people of color. To learn more, visit ebbirth.com/membership.